the music industry is such a complex place, right? And there's so many different perspectives. There's so many different like actors acting in the very different things. Like me and some friends used to say there isn't one music industry. There's multiple music industries, and it's more like a music ecosystem, we should call it, rather than industry. But I guess like at that moment, I had the perspective of, if I was a indie creator or an indie like label, indie rights holder, it looks very difficult coming up.
Sponsored by Allfeet, decentralized blockchain solutions for the music industry. Produced by Amplitude Ventures Consulting, partners in early stage music tech. Dan is a brilliant thinker in music and tech, and on this episode we talk about the changing landscape of the industry, challenges, opportunities, and the wild ride ahead. I loved hearing his unfiltered take on what's next, and I learned a ton. Let me know what you think afterward. Great, guys. Doing a smooth transition into the podcast. Me and Dan, we already started talking. I was like, okay, we need to get in recording. Dan, you here because we are ready for some darkness. I read the brilliant LinkedIn post of yours, and anyone who knows you knows you're a brilliant thinker, and maybe so complex that most people don't understand what you're talking about. But let's talk about those complex things. Dan, welcome.
Thank you. What an intro.
No, Dan, you're very fascinating. You're one of the people where I pride myself in understanding content really fast, but some of your posts and Medium articles, like you have posted in the past, I'm just like stopping every section, like, oh shit, that was even a term I didn't know. So Dan, you seem like you're some sort of lexicon of music industry and reflection. So what are you going to bring to us today?
I mean, I think well, you reached out to me because I wrote some posts about I was in a bit of a bad mood, I'll be honest, and I put some posts which actually, like, for transparency, I've actually since deleted, because I was like, actually, I don't need that kind of negativity around me. But it generated quite a lot of interest, and I was basically sort of painting out that the sort of like the next 18 months is going to be pretty difficult for the music industry. And so I think that's what we're going to talk about, right? it's kind of like what's coming next, I guess.
I was actually looking at the LinkedIn earlier today to find the post again. Luckily, I had screenshotted it because I sent it to you and said, "Hey, Dan, do you want to talk about this?" But yeah, so let's solidify it in a podcast instead. It's a good thing you deleted it on LinkedIn. But I think we have one thing in common, maybe for different reasons. But I'm also a bit depressed about the future outlook of the music industry. Could you dissect for me? We'll get into, you make a personal introduction in a moment, but can you dissect for me, why did you write that on LinkedIn? What was the reasoning behind it?
So I think where my head was at was thinking through. So I think the music industry is such a complex place, right? And there's so many different perspectives. There's so many different like actors acting in the very different things. Like me and some friends used to say there isn't one music industry. There's multiple music industries, and it's more like a music ecosystem, we should call it, rather than industry. But I guess like at that moment, I had the perspective of, if I was a indie creator or an indie like label, indie rights holder, it looks very difficult coming up. And I think the reason why I deleted it is because actually it doesn't dwell to, it doesn't do to dwell on being negative, but I think the important thing is that there are some considerations, and I think that what I was really trying to say is the business is going to change quite a lot, and I guess reasons for that we can get into it, but I think there's quite a few sort of like macro effects that are sort of starting to converge quite a bit. And the impact of that is really less jobs, basically. Less jobs and harder to break through. It's kind of like the summary, I guess. But we, yeah. How do you want to dive through this? Because there's quite a bit there.
Yeah, there's so many angles diving into that, and I often, because it's easy, come from like the creator angle, with like dilution of value, or basically taking away like that midsection of quality. But if you were to take an angle from somewhere else, where would you start?
Yeah, so I think so I just like before we jumped on this call, I was just trying to dissect this into my own thoughts. And I think like the starting point here is, so like the general state of the creative industries in 2025. Like I think that when we look back on the last 10, 15 years, it's actually been a bit of a golden age, despite everybody's issues that they have with, for example, like Spotify payouts, or all of the narratives that we've heard and probably said ourselves multiple times. Actually, it's been pretty good. The industry has kind of like come back to growth, and we've all seen the charts of where it's kind of like now above where it used to be before sort of the internet changed the game. My counter to that is always, well, that's not in real terms, but putting that to one side. But things are changing, and I think like the best example of this, I think, is do you know Matthew Ball?
Yeah.
So Matthew Ball is an analyst who sort of came to sort of like he came to fame in the last couple of years because he was the one or he claims to have coined the term the metaverse in terms of like how we know it now. So he wrote this whole thesis around the metaverse, and then it was at the same time that Facebook changed to Meta, and there's this whole thing going on. Anyway, his real sort of like speciality is video games. And so he's done this, written out this piece, and it's like 240 slides. You can find it. It's called the State of Video Gaming in 2025. And it's a really fascinating read because I think that like when you speak to people about the music industry, one of the first things they'll say is, well, there's not enough revenue. And actually, if the music industry did more like the games industry, then there'd be a lot more revenue, and like, it would be a much more healthy ecosystem. That is probably true. But what is also true is that the games industry is now, the games industry is completely plateaued. In the past 3 years, before the last 3 years, so the previous 10 years, it saw growth that like far eclipsed real GDP. In the last 3 years, it's completely plateaued. And there's been mass layoffs across the entire industry. And so like what he really picks into there is that games had certain growth drivers, had certain things that it really focused on, did really well, things like free to play, like all these different things. However, they've basically dried up and they're not delivering the same level of growth. So even though like the games industry, and I promise I'll put this back to music in a second, but like my point is the general creative industries, but like even the games industry, which is seen as like the golden child of like the creative industries over the past 10 years, is struggling. And it's, arguably quite far advanced in terms of monetization strategies and all these kind of things. If even the games industry is struggling, then you have to then take a look at other things. And so then like coming to music, music has very much been sustained on streaming over the past 10 years now, I guess. But especially in the past few years when people like Goldman Sachs, etc., have like had all these massive forecasts. However, anybody who's on the inside knows that growth has been really dependent on I mean, basically the future growth within streaming is focused around the lower ARPU regions, to try and cut to the chase here. And that creates a plateau in value. And that is kind of like it is creating a major issue, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, for example, in Norway, where I'm from, I think I can't remember how much you have adopted to streaming, but I close to 85 or 90%. Like, yeah. So okay, so basically, saying that the numbers of growth within streaming primarily are from regions that's not going to bring the monetary value in comparison to what we sort of are just looking at when we look at growth numbers.
And well, the frustrating thing though is that kind of everybody knows that and has known that for years. It's just it's not been a convenient thing to focus on. So that's one element. I think another element is around again a kind of more a less obvious thing is the fact that basically every single major company in the music industry that could go public has gone public now. And there's been essentially a transfer of ownership within that process. So, it's reported like every couple of months, Daniel Ek is pulling out more stock from Spotify. The other co-founders are as well. It was reported last week, I think it was, that Bill Ackman is kind of forcing UMG to list in New York. There's like an overall change here in terms of like the ownership,
Mm.
which has inevitably forced the conversation much more around a cost focused conversation. And the challenge then is like, as the world is changing so as quickly as it is, how do the pipes within the industry, who's investing in the future for that versus that cost focused mentality? And I think that anybody who's worked at a startup and tried to sell their product into the music industry that is based on efficiency rather than revenue generation will
Mm.
understand what I'm saying here, is that it's really hard. It's really, really, really hard. And all the signs point to it becoming even harder. So I think that's another really important one, is that there is an element of, and I'm trying not to use too negative words, but there is an element of the industry effectively being cash cowed, which makes for a challenging environment. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. It's so funny, like just some of my own reflections. I work with startups on a daily basis, hands-on on a daily basis, involved in 45 startups within our portfolio. And then I meet startups all the time, as mentors or consultants or whatever. And one of the things I've been talking with my business partner, Taj, about, he's also starting a podcast in this space, is how little potential we actually see. And the reason why I'm saying that is I jumped in a call with a particular person in the music industry a week ago, and that person was so optimistic about, innovation in music and so many startups and incubators and all that kind of stuff, and so positive, and was a very established person also with a technology background. So nothing against, his credentials, but I would just stop him and say, like, I can't see what you're saying. I can't
Mm.
see that overwhelming flood of talented founders building with and for the industry, and that whole synergy thing going. Like, I might just be isolated here in Norway, but the world is pretty digital, so I get to see a lot of things. I just don't see it.
No, I've had similar conversations, which have essentially been the only areas in music tech that are getting any funding and any interest right now are in OpenAI front ends, and some kind of quote unquote super fan, direct to fan, what
Mm.
we used to call direct to fan back in the day, engagement platforms. Um, yeah, it's definitely it's definitely tricky, and I think yeah, there is a challenge. I think like it's always been challenging to so challenge a lot there. It's always been challenging to get funding in music tech in general. I think that we all know the sort of the story you need to spin generally to get any kind of like, well, especially for like a VC check. It's like, oh yeah, we're doing this thing in music. Music is always first to the plate, but actually this thing that we can do is more generalizable, and it's going to be all content. And actually, the TAM on this is actually 25 billion or the $25 trillion. Like, so that is definitely a thing. But then, I mean, the third thing that's really in my head and has become increasingly so. Um, I don't want to like turn this podcast into a whole like AI chat, but like it is a really, really interesting time right now, in that like traditionally the three like, I mean, yeah, the three of the core markets of the music industry are essentially going down three different routes when it comes to how AI should be regulated right now. In the EU has its position, and position around like exceptions for text and data mining. The US is behind that position in that like it still hasn't come out. The copyright office still hasn't come out yet. But there's the court cases there which are all about fair use. And then the UK right now is has a call for evidence. Like literally right now, it's going to close in the next month or so, where it's suggesting that it should go similar way to the EU, but there's a lot of pushback around the opt-out versus opt-in question. Whereas in the EU has settled on a opt-out, whereas people in the UK are kind of pushing towards the opt-in. Um, why this is a challenge is that with this very uncertain regulatory environment, like it becomes very difficult to raise any funding, right? Because if you're an investor, why would you invest in that versus an industry, another industry where there's a more certain environment? But it also means that, like, regardless of which option gets chosen, there's going to need to be a lot more infrastructure built to be able to support it. You know, if it's opt in, opt out, whatever it is, I mean, I can't see a world where you don't have to have some form of global repertoire database, which basically tells people if it's opt in or opt out or something in between. So yeah, there's so many things going on, and then I guess the final piece would be, before we can move on from the darkness, the final piece would be the consolidation of the industry, which it's really hard to look past. You know, PS finally being fully acquired by Universal. Brain's just gone. Fuga's parent company, Downtown, the Downtown acquisition. You know, like when my frame of mind at that point was around sort of the indie side of things and all these pressures, and also quite a few of my friends who've been made unemployed over the past year or so, kind of built up to this quite interesting position. But what I will say is, on that post, I did also point towards a future that was a different future where creators could do something different. But maybe we'll get onto that.
Yeah, because I think that's interesting. You know, thank you for the whole thing, and it is complicated to sort of see the whole movement together, like consolidation and metadata, and like I think it's really, we might touch upon it again in the podcast, but it's difficult concept. So I'll just skip to something a bit easier first, and that is exactly to the point where you ended here, and that is how creators can maybe monetize in a different way, or think a bit different way, or maybe just steer away from how music is telling the story right now. Like I truly believe that the new generation of creators already starting now will be fundamentally different from what kind of creators there are now within music. Different personalities, different capabilities, different types of skill sets, and I believe firmly in the TikTok generation and in the way, not necessarily that was the wrong term, but like the streaming, the fans, you know, the whole thing that Mr. B started, and then moved into like all these niche streamers. And even though I don't follow that world, like I observe a lot, and for me, that like such a brilliant way of getting fans and having them sort of engage with creators. Is that the argument you're pointing towards, that that's how creators maybe should think in the future, or like where are we going with that point?
I don't know what the answer is, but what I can point to is something that's maybe excited over the past 3 months, and it comes from completely outside of music. I played League of Legends since beta. I've I've kind of followed that ecosystem for a while alongside other games. There is a streamer in League, a guy called Cajal, who was a professional player. So League of Legends is a game where there's a kind of like competitive element to it, and you know, it's like it is the premier esport, as they call it. So you know, they have like regional competitions all through the year, and then there's a world's like world finals sort of thing. Anyway, this guy who's an ex-pro was a commentator for a bit, and then realized he could make way more money being a streamer. And then he's essentially built up an audience that is bigger than the official broadcast, just through his streaming.
Yeah.
And then he has used that audience that he's built up there to start his own professional team. And they're called Los Ratones. So he has this audience, and So he's built this team, and like the differentiating factor of this team, as it were, is that they do everything live. So they stream everything, every conversation they have, like every practice, everything. Um, which means that, on like a Tuesday afternoon, there'll be 50,000 people watching his team practice, essentially.
Mm.
And then when there's a match day, then there's a lot more. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic. And I'm not saying that's going to be appropriate for everybody, but this idea of building an audience, going audience first, essentially, like building up an audience, something that has kind of been abstracted away from artists in that, like, the audience has been on the platform rather than their audience. And, it's still an audience within Twitch, but you get my point. You build them up and then you bring them along with the journey. Bring them along for the journey. So, he started this project. It has so much support from it. And it's just grown from strength to strength to strength. They're arguably already like the second most popular team in the entire space, and they're playing in like a regional league. Anyway, I just think it's really interesting. And I think that, is this like directly applicable to music? Possibly. But I think that like the mentality in it, which is like not being scared to completely open up the process with the intention of like bringing the audience along for the ride. I think that's a really interesting one. And I can't help but feel that that will be quite a major dynamic going forward.
Mm. But if you were to imagine comparable scenarios for music, I'm putting you on the spot, that could maybe borrow from that mentality, like what kind of examples could that be?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this. If there was, you create a band and you basically stream the entire process. You basically turn the band into your own personal TV show. That would be the direct applicable thing. And I think that like with all these things, like trying to find a direct like comparator is often like inaccurate, but that would be an example, right? Is that like from the formation of the band all the way through to playing a festival, like it's a process that people can become part of. And I think that's cool. I think that, and again, it won't be for everyone. It won't be for everyone. Like a lot of artists want to make art and only make art, and that needs to be respected as well. But like there's this bit that sort of like gnaws away at me a little bit. It's like the potential market for that. The potential market for that has been decreasing over time. It's become harder and harder to just be an artist that puts out art and that's it. And we've kind of seen that through the social media age. And, this I think is a potential direction where that goes, for all of its good and bad.
The lack of this in general, like, also just has its ripple effects in the industry. That the monetization doesn't happen that effectively. Very few cases actually engage and monetize or think creatively beyond the set, platforms out there. Like I've been coding a lot lately. Actually, last week I think I've been pretty much 90% just coding, and I'm not going to say what I earn from that, but just me personally, hour and hour coding, I earn 2 to 3 times as much as a normal consultant, because I can create value instantly and sell that to companies. I'm pretty much an expert in music. Like,
Yep.
I've lived and breathed it for 12 years, pretty public person. People come to me all the time. Making anything that would be remotely called a good salary, if I just was a one-person business, would be hard.
Yep.
And it's just a stupid comparison, but it's really led me to reflect so much lately. One thing is that it's been hard. It's always been hard, that's fine. But when you compare it so much to like I literally started coding seriously 5 months ago. And if I quit my company now and just started coding full time, I'll be good. Like But that for me has just shocked me. Like it was sort of a wake up call last few weeks. Like, what am I doing in music? And it's not because it's about money. So obviously I know why I'm in
Yeah,
music. But for me, it's just like it's so perplexing.
yeah. It's really difficult. And I think that there's a slightly like quasi like abusive relationship that goes on with regards to people who work in the music industry. And again, kind of like I guess this kind of reflects back to the original kind of post I put on LinkedIn. It was speaking very much as from a voice of somebody who's working in the music industry
Yep.
and like thinking about like future opportunity and that kind of thing. Um, like there is this kind of thing that keeps people in working in the music industry, be that a creator or somebody who's a copyright expert or whatever it is, which is that there is a love for what you do. But there is a breaking point on that as well, and like the real risk is that the people who talent leads, you get a brain drain from the industry. And that is one of my fears as well, if I'm being honest, is that we could see that quite heavily. Um, as this whole sort of like industry wide cost reduction exercise happens. Um, but then the flip side of that is actually it's an industry growing up, and that maybe those jobs shouldn't exist in the future, and that
Mm.
new better jobs, new more different jobs, maybe not better, different jobs, um, will exist in their place, and actually it's a bit Ludditish to kind of like lament that. But I don't know, this is just kind of what's really like in my head right now,
Yeah.
within like what it means to work in the music industry right now. um the typical kind of like tech response to that would be, move on, old man. It's time for the new way of doing things. But I think there's a balance between the two. um and especially just going back to this point about the infrastructure, my background has been very much around sort of working out business models for the back end of the industry. And yeah, that's it's a really, really difficult.
Yeah. Talking about business models, like one of the things that is perplexing about all of this is as a person running a venture studio, we have a lot of people coming through our company that's not necessarily music. And we often, if not always, can find very clear growth opportunities from new technology.
Mhm.
I fail to see an absolute clarity in music. Like I fail to see it. There might be some, but I don't see that significant, positive change. Do you see any?
um I think it is really difficult, because of the um the unique dynamics of, I guess, intellectual property in general, to be honest. Um, in that it is a mm, intangible good that's like supported by essentially legal precedents, which creates these restricted acts, and then you have to have a license to to exercise those restricted rights. Um, that means that there's always in music going to be a friction between like how technology could change things, and also how that applies to the essentially the human rights that creators have, um which is the challenge, right? That is like, if you want to get really deep into why is it so hard to be a music tech founder, it's that friction. And it's not to get too highbrow, but this is where I often bring up it's literally recorded in the UN's Declaration of Human Rights, so Article 27. It has this like coupling of statements which I'm going to butcher because I don't totally remember them verbatim, but it is essentially that everyone has a human right to experience the expression of art, and everybody has the human right to be compensated for human art, right? And that's basically the friction that it kind of like defines the playing field on which we're all trying to play.
Mhm.
Um, um, and yeah, so that's I think that's why it's really hard to like be this like future caster, like looking into your tea leaves and saying, okay, this technology AI is going to do this, and that's where the industry is going to go. It's really difficult to do that. Like AI being a really good example, right? It's like everyone's like, okay, cool, AI is going to come in, it's going to flood the zone, it's going to be really really difficult. It's going to become like so much more difficult for you as a creator to be able to get above that noise. Blah blah blah. You know, the future's bleak. And then the flip side of that is actually, you know, creativity is one of the most important parts of the training data that makes up AI. Um, and you know, the regulatory environment is still being formed, but um, as long as it resolves in a way that allows for creators to be able to be compensated when their creations are used and new things are generated from them, be that through opt-in, opt-out, whatever it is, then actually there's a totally new monetization vertical here that wasn't previously available and is additive to the other side of things. You know, like there's this constant like um, yin and yang, I guess.
Hmm. Yeah, there is, and I do buy that argument of more monetization, but what I'm more concerned with is just like how does that look from the next generation? And it's not because to be honest, I'm not that concerned about what the music industry is right now. And that's my position as sort of like a neutral business developer. I think that's only my benefit. So I don't have a particular love for what is, but I do love creation, and I do love the music industry because of its uniqueness.
Mhm.
And so I'm very concerned about the those two together. Um, so when monetization works, unless you're an extremely liked, sought after, well exposed creator in the future, you won't see any benefits from monetization of training data. Because that's based on previous creativity, and the creativity in the future, unless you like significantly influential in whatever is publicly consumed, that monetization strategy is going to be left for whatever was rather than what's to come. And that argument, I don't believe, is sufficient for the future. I might be wrong. What do you think about that?
I think it's interesting. Uh, I think the answer to, or I think the counter to what you said comes from how the licensing deals are done. It's more of a commercial question than like a regulatory or a
Yeah.
moralistic question. It's like once the regulatory moralistic positions are set, then it comes down to how the commercials are done. If you are just one creator of a million and it's done through a blanket license, it's paid out according to market share, then you're going to get very little. Um, if you are a really interesting creator and you go more of the like Holly Herndon approach, where you kind of like people can train off your data exclusively and you can charge it out by yourself, like that. There's potentially interesting models there, like artists within a certain genre club together and allow for people to train within a certain scene or a genre. Then you can see things coming up from there, and that there's possibly a higher value there. I think, like, again, this is where the commercialization side comes in, and there's probably loads and loads of different ways that could potentially go. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that might be true. And but what I'm scared of is I'll make a small analogy. So uh, again, I'm coding a lot right now. We're building mostly AI agents, like very complex, very very complex systems, which is incredibly fun. Also mind-boggling, and I don't sleep a lot. But what's really interesting is just the development in LLM, large language models, access. we've been sticking a lot to sort of OpenAI, Claude, like the American standards, but like really been exploring new things. And then DeepSeek, the Chinese company, came out and just they did the R1 model, which is 96% cheaper than the O1 reasoning model. And just in a moment like that, so many more opportunities open because of what's financially feasible.
Mhm.
Like in just one announcement, and O1 just released O1 and O1 Pro. I can't keep track of time. I guess a month ago or something like that.
Yeah.
It's going so fast that month over month, like new business opportunities opens up, new ways of creating that was not feasible financially opens out. And I'm not saying music's going to be like that because obviously it's a different thing, but it is going to be affected by that speed of change.
Completely agree.
So,
Yep.
so those arguments might be very true now and in the near future. I'm just very doubtful about what the future holds, because if it's just like even a tenth of what new technology is doing, then it will probably look a lot different in 3 years.
I think that's the only certainty we can have, is that things will look very different in 3 years. Yeah, I mean, I think that the mindset I think you have to have, as somebody who cares about the music industries and the wider creative industries and intellectual property in general, is that it's probably the most important time in history right now. Definitely, at least since sort of like the early days of the internet, but arguably in history, to really fight the case for why music's important, and why creators are important. As I say, I think that any large language model that doesn't use music is going to be worse than one that does, in the way that it's training up and building from there.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that, as I say, I think like true human creativity is probably one of the most valuable things that we as a species output. And that's important. That needs to be fully supported in that. And that's why I think this is just such an interesting point and really important point right now, is that like those arguments are made. And as I say, like the frustration is that there is a bit of a lack of global harmony in that. But then again, you mentioned that I do this at the top of this podcast. But then there's another element here, which is that I don't think that I can ever remember a time when technology and geopolitics was so intertwined. It can't be any coincidence that the DeepSeek announcement came out in Trump's first week of becoming the US president.
No, it's crazy.
And committing $100 billion to AI, to AI infrastructure, and yeah, I mean, there's loads. We could do an entire podcast on DeepSeek right now, right? But like, what's really interesting about DeepSeek is that there's a lot of training on other AIs that's kind of contributed to the fact that it was so efficient, and so the excitement there is that we're probably looking at a very fast race at the bottom with regards to the price of AI, where it becomes pseudo free. The challenge there is that if all music is driving these things and it's pseudo free, then it's like a world that's very analogous to where music was free to stream. And yeah, so there's lots going on. There's lots going on.
Yeah, there's lots going on, and I think the only safe harbor I can find in all of these discussions is that I believe that human connection will continue to be valuable and even more valuable in the future. How monetization of that would take place, I'm unsure of. I think there's some things that would stay, pretty clear. I do believe that physical experiences will be sought after. I do believe that letting people into your life, like you mentioned, would also be sought after. I do believe that that music needs to be very catered, like very um, how do I say this? It needs to be real, obviously, but I think there needs to be a lot of clarity on who you're catering to, who are you making music to, who are you marketing to, and that's seen only from an angle of really of intent, which isn't a bad thing in any other industry. But in music, at least from a music school perspective, conservatories seems very foreign. That you need to have a plan in mind when you're making music, when you're connecting with your audiences. And so those three pillars I have trust in. There's probably a few more,
Yeah.
but
I agree with you, and I think that human connectivity is like something that's never really sat with me was people who were super bullish on um like virtual artists. Um like again going back to League of Legends, and ironically, that's something they've traditionally done quite well. But people will look at that and say, "Oh, it's a band of cartoon images." What they don't understand is those cartoon images are the characters that people play in the game and have built up that weird, like, pseudo-human relationship with them. Um, I think that human connectivity is just going to be such an important element within it. Um, Ultimately, when it comes down to business model, though, I think that I still think there's pretty much only ever going to be two business models on the internet. It's going to be advertising or subscription. And then whatever the kind of, like when you're talking about like new technology, and like how that can come in, I think it still really comes down to what the business model will be. But is it advertising, is it subscription? And I guess, like pointing to this, the way it works within, for example, Twitch, is kind of a combination of all the above. Which another sort of like shout out, Ben Thompson, the analyst, did a piece on the unified content model. Unified content model, that's what it's called. Unified content business model. There we go. Which is really talking to that. I mean, I think his focus then was very much around how Netflix started to bring in advertising. But I think that there is no better example of the unified content business model than Twitch. And yeah, I think that like if I could hope to see something new happen in the next 5 years in the music industries, and wider creative industries, it would be for there to be more experimentation in business model.
mm,
I I fear that when streaming became the model, innovation stopped in terms of business model. And that's partly to do with the way that licensing works. But it's created this particularly brutal zero-sum game, whereby everybody's essentially fighting for market share with each other. And it's just, yeah, I think that's a big part of the reason why the situation looks as it does now.
if you were to start a business right now, what would that be?
Well, I wouldn't be talking to you, would I? I'd be doing it. Um, what would it be? I think I would have to do something in line with what I've just been talking about. But okay, so I think the biggest opportunity that is on the table, just generally,
Mm.
is in and let's just put a music slant on it. Is in Western creators understanding the Indonesian market. I think that this is something that whenever you are working with an artist or whatever, if you look in the statistics, Indonesia is always like right at the top of the listening figures in terms of like audience. If you, I keep on talking about streamers, but I think it's important. I think it's an interesting analogy. Like so much of their streaming audience within Twitch comes from that region, and yet you see people in labels, etc., talking about like a China strategy or an India strategy, but I don't think I've ever seen anybody talk about what's the like Indonesian strategy or like the Vietnamese strategy or whatever. I feel like it's like a part of the it's I just don't understand why. And I think why it's particularly interesting is because whereas in say China, which is obviously a huge potential market, there's a real disjoint in terms of like ways that people use the internet. Same can be said for Korea as well. It's different sites, it's different ways that people engage. In the case of China, it's literally a different internet, the Great Firewall. Whereas within like Southeast Asia, very much the same platforms, and I just don't understand why nobody's really focused on that. And maybe they haven't, I just haven't seen it. But I think that something around there is probably one of the bigger opportunities. So, working with artists to a business that works with artists to help them understand the streaming ecosystem and particularly targets Indonesia. There you go. That's what I would do.
It's very precise. Can you maybe just break down what do you believe listeners, consumers in Indonesia does that's differently from other regions?
I think it's just a lot of people. I think it's a massively underserved market. That is, I'm speaking as if I'm an expert here, and I'm absolutely not. This is more just observation.
Yeah.
But from what I can observe, and again, I wouldn't start a business just on my observations, but from what I can observe, there's a lot of there's a lot of cultural there's a lot of shared space, I guess, in terms of like social interactions and cultural interactions and that kind of thing. I don't know how. I'm sure there's a much more eloquent way I could describe that. But it's a huge growing market of people, and there's just a shitload of people. Huge market, potential market that I feel like is massively underserved, but I could be wrong.
Interesting. Like I was reflecting while you were answering, what would my answer be to that question?
Quite a hard question. I've just like painted myself as some expert in something that I have no knowledge about at all. But that's what you do when you're on the spot.
but I did find it interesting from your answer that it wasn't any of the obvious choices, because
what would be an obvious choice, do you think?
Well, it would be something related to fan engagement, or something related to solving the black box issue, or I'm not saying it can't be done, but there's
no such thing as a black box.
Yeah, but while I was reflecting, my answer would be besides the one technology business I'm doing music that I'm very bullish about, nothing. Like as of right now, when I'm looking at the industry and I see so many companies, and I'm not saying I'm right, there's nothing that attracts me. Like and maybe I'm definitely not bitter, so that's not where I'm going. But like, I've been an entrepreneur for 12 years. Like, I've paid my dues. I've done the investment. I've sacrificed time, energy, youth, everything. I'm only 32, but I've been there for a long time. And looking at the sort of opportunity cost of music right now as a founder, it's just not there. Like, not right now. I'm excited to see where it is in sort of 2 to 3 months after the first like few cities have been destroyed by the wave, and see what lies there. But as of right now, there are like very few things that excites me from a founder's side, which is kind of scary. Like, I did not feel like that a year ago. Obviously, I was maybe less informed than I am now because I spent a lot of time speaking to people like yourself. But that it's a scary feeling. Like, in my own industry, I don't see what I would want to do besides a few things I'm still believing in.
If I can play the old man in this conversation, then comes in waves. I've been there. I've been there multiple times. I've gone from inside industry to working for startups to back inside industry working for startups, and it kind of waves and comes and goes. I mean, but I think the serious point there is that startup innovation does come in waves. You have these kind of like metas that evolve. Like I've been involved in 2 waves of blockchain meta. where there's certain narratives that evolve, and people will build on those narratives and evolve those narratives. And then I actually wrote a piece on exactly this when about blockchain. And so probably you could probably argue that we're in the trough after the initial AI music wave, and that there'll probably be something else that comes at some point in that world. But I think that like the fact that you're saying that, I think is probably as much testament to the fact that there's no emerging narrative right now around like what's really really interesting, and that can become quite frustrating. Um, my in my own experience, those are the times when I will often take a step back and stop trying to build a startup and start trying to analyze what are the limitations within the ecosystem that mean that you can't build a startup in the way that you want to. Um, again, like a lot of my professional career has been spent around the infrastructure side of things, like copyright databases, like licensing process, that kind of thing. After when I was working at a startup called Jack, once we started to unwind that, I went back and worked for ICE, the Pan European Copyright licensing hub, with two very clear goals in mind. One was, how can I make it so that it's easier for startups to get access to copyright data? And another one was, how can I make it so that it's easier and cheaper for startups to access rights? How can they get licenses? And then when I was there, I built out a whole data policy and a self-service licensing tool. So that's my own personal model, has been when the inspiration isn't there, when it feels like the narratives aren't there, that you can kind of work with. Often it's better to try and fix problems. And I guess I've kind of like evolved like this over time, and I don't want to be a founder anymore. I think I probably just want to work on fixing problems, but yeah, that's my position on it, or that's generally how I've gone about it anyway.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So for the listeners on the podcast, I think I'm gonna go a bit in like it sounds wrong, but like a bit in hiding from the music industry for like a while. I'm still gonna do the podcast. I have a lot of articles and pieces that we're gonna do on music tech financing, so I'm just still gonna be very present. But I think more from a pessimist or a neutral standpoint for a while, just because I am gonna sort of use my time on something I believe is worth my time as of right now, and then come back to music as a long-term thing. Again, back to, this last week, I have probably been coding 40 hours and doing like music, CEO kind of work, maybe 5, 6, 7, 10, because I don't see how there's a comparable value, which is odd to say. But the truth as of right now, does it make sense?
It makes complete sense to me as somebody who's been through the ringer multiple times. I think well, it kind of goes back to that point we were saying, which is that if you allow working in the music industry to be like an abusive relationship where you kind of feel like you're being kept there because you feel like you have a duty to be there, and you're not getting from it what you feel like you need to, then it's probably worth thinking about that relationship. But I think that taking a step to the side. By the way, for what it's worth, I did exactly the same as you last year. I quit everything and I taught myself to code from scratch in 3 months, because I just needed a bit of like a different perspective on things. My kind of like conclusion from that was that I can do that, but I'm really way more interested in like the regulatory policy side of things. I've kind of got like the commercial experience, and I've got like, I feel like I've got a fairly comprehensive and relatively unique perspective across like the CMO, copyright management, um, startup, rights holder, creator, investor perspective. Um, and the business models and the strategies and the narratives are important there. Um, but I want to kind of like take that and move that into more of like a regulatory perspective, like like just helping to shape the macro environment rather than trying to optimize within it. Well, that was an eloquent way of putting it. So that was my kind of like outcome from that process.
Yeah.
But I do think it's important people go through that. If they feel like um, if they're not excited fundamentally.
Yeah. It's an odd way to sort of end a podcast, but I think it's very relevant, and it does play off the I don't want to call it negative energy of your LinkedIn post, but for me it was just very I liked it. Like I liked that a person that I believe is very, very forward thinking about the industry, but also really understands it deeply, can write such a LinkedIn post, and that's why I wrote you. Like, Dan, I really respect you, and I love what you said on the podcast, and that's for once, just be real. And I'm being real right now. I think you're being real. And let's see what the future holds. It might be bright, it might be good, it might be fun. Yeah.
It will be bright. It will be fun.